Now, when I start my presentations in Europe, I usually start out with a map, and I show them Guam, because a lot of people have never heard of Guam, and if they have heard of it, they might not be able to place it on a map. So then I usually zoom in and I tell them about Guam's cultural history and about the demographic information. But I don't have to do that here because you all probably know a lot more about Guam's culture than I do. So I'm going to use that time and explain to you why someone from Switzerland would come all the way to Guam to do research. I've always been interested in varieties of language and varieties of English, and particularly in varieties of American English. I did an internship at the Dictionary of American Regional English in Madison, Wisconsin, and I also wrote my master thesis on regional variation in African American English. And with that work, I learned about the differences in vocabulary and pronunciation across the United States. And Guam speakers have long been in contact with the United States, and I assume that this influence is reflected in Guam English. And that's one aspect that I'm really interested in looking at. Secondly, Switzerland has been known to punch well above its weight when it comes to research in Englishes in remote places. So a variety of universities in Switzerland have sent people to Fiji, for example, Tristan da Cunha, St. Helena, Bermuda, Cocos-Keeling in the Indian Ocean, and also Micronesia. My supervisor, David Britton, he has long been interested in the Englishes spoken in Micronesia, and he himself has done research in Palau, but he's also supervised projects in Kiribati, Nauru, Koshrai, Saipan, as well as Guam. Now, why are we interested in studying these Englishes, including Guam English? And by the way, I'm going to be calling it Guam English. There's other terms you could use. You could say Guam Colloquial English or Guam Dialect of English, but I'm simply going to go with Guam English. There's not just one English language spoken across the globe, but there are lots of varieties. And a lot of those varieties emerged through colonialism. People from English-speaking countries, such as England, Ireland, Scotland, or the United States, they explored the world and expanded their rule to new places. And the places that they encountered, they often influenced the indigenous people, and they introduced them to their own culture, religion, and also language. And they influenced them so much that oftentimes the indigenous people started adopting large parts of the English language. And sometimes it was a mix of both languages. Sometimes they would just adopt some vocabulary. Sometimes they would create what we call a pidgin that can then later evolve to a Creole. And in some cases, the English language was adopted entirely. And of course, in many occasions, this did not happen voluntarily. It was a result of strict impositions on the indigenous people. And it also didn't happen overnight, but it was a very slow process. And that included close interaction with the indigenous and the colonial ruler. The German linguist Eckhard Schneider has come up with a model, and that he argues applies for many Englishes that have emerged through colonialism. He coined the term post-colonial Englishes. In his model, he describes phases that many of the new Englishes have gone through as they emerged from the contact between new Anglophone settlers and the indigenous people. Starting out with the foundation phase, where people of two different cultures and languages first start interacting. At this point, the English of the new settlers is probably various at this point as well. And it might become leveled or simplified as they interact with the indigenous people. And as the interaction becomes more frequent, locals start adopting vocabulary, grammatical rules, and they might develop a sort of intermixed version between English and the native language. And then the new generation takes up that intermixed version and makes it their own, and slowly a new type of English develops. And that is often very different from the English that the colonial ruler brought to that new place. You can see such an example in Australia. and New Zealand. So settlers originally from areas like England, Scotland, and Ireland, they arrived, and through the interaction with natives, a new dialect of English formed that is recognizably different and unique from any other Englishes spoken in the UK. So I'm not going to go too much into detail with this model proposed by Schneider, but what's interesting is that for his model, Schneider only considered one variety of English that emerged from contact with the United States as a colonial ruler, and that's the Philippines. And all the other examples come from British colonialism. And with a population of over 160,000 people, Guam is one of the most densely populated places where English has emerged from colonialism. Long story short, this is why I'm here to present the study on Guam, or this is why someone from Switzerland would be interested in studying Guam English. And it might be worth mentioning to you why I'm not here. I'm not here to tell you how to speak proper English or to point out any mistakes. This is simply descriptive linguistic work. And I'm here today to present some of the work that I've done up to this point. And I've organized my presentation in a way kind of similarly to how I started my introduction. So when I zoomed in on Guam on the Google Maps images, I will start out with the big picture by briefly telling you about how and why people on Guam came in contact with the English language. And then I will put my main focus of this talk on reporting about my project, and I will go and how I go about conducting research in Guam. I will then zoom in a little bit and tell you about some of the detailed findings of my study. Maybe you remember the title of this study, Guam English. You've all heard it, but what does it really sound like? And what I meant by that is that we're going to take a really close look, or I should say a really close listen, to some of the peculiarities of Guam English. We will go into some really nitty-gritty stuff and listen to the small differences in pronunciations of consonants and vowels of some typical Guam English speakers. And finally, I will talk a little bit about the variation that takes place amongst Guam English speakers. And then I will end my talk by giving you a preview of what's to come in my research project. Okay. And as I said before, I still have over 2 years of funding for this project. So if you listen to my talk and you come up with a few things, or you remember a few things that you would like me to know, or that you think I should be looking into in more detail, I will leave my email address at the end so you can contact me and let me know. So how English arrived on Guam. A lot of you will already know the background information of how English arrived in Guam and why a lot of young people are now English speakers, mainly monolingually. So I will keep this part quite short. Guam's first contact with the Western world was in the 16th century with the beginning of the Spanish occupation. And the main language that the local population came in contact with was Spanish, but English was also present because a lot of whalers frequently stopped over on Guam, and they were speaking English. Then in 1898, when Guam was ceded by Spain to the United States, the contact with English quickly became more frequent. The naval administration introduced formal education, and so the lessons were held in English. And the inhabitants were vigorously reminded to learn English because it was claimed that this would be the language that would bring them success. This is a quote from the Guam Recorder from 1925 that emphasizes the importance of learning English because it will enable the inhabitants to live in a correct manner, it will lead to economic development, and it will bring real pleasures in life. And some of my older speakers also reported that they were punished for speaking Chamorro, but Chamorro was still frequently spoken in the homes. And when the Japanese arrived in 1941, English was forbidden to be spoken. And for the next 3 years, school was taught in Japanese. And during that time, a lot of children were not allowed to go to school, or they were not able to go to school. They had to work. And I think because this time was relatively short, Japanese did not have as much of an influence on Guam as it did on other Micronesian islands, such as Palau or Saipan. And then during the second American period is when a real difference in adopting the English language occurred. Wartime had been tough and is reported of having been an incredibly brutal time for the people. And so they would sing songs and wishing for the US forces to liberate them from the Japanese occupation. The sense of gratitude that was felt when the United States returned might be one of the reasons why English spread so rapidly. And it was during this time also that the first generation of Chamorros decided to raise their children in English. And then already in the late 1980s, Baruch and Spalding reported that Guam now had a generation of young people who share American ideals and aspire to an American lifestyle. And this close affiliation with the United States is reflected in the way people on Guam speak English. And the purpose of my study is to analyze this English. In order to study and closely analyze this variety spoken here, we have to have data, speech data to be exact. So when I first arrived on Guam last year, my main goal, apart from learning about the culture and Guam in general, was to collect that data. So I wanted to record casual conversations with the locals. And coming in as an outsider who doesn't know much about Guam, this was not an easy task. I had to walk up to people at the mall, at social gatherings, and ask them if they were from Guam, whether they would like to be part of my project. And as a relatively shy and introverted person, this was quite challenging for me. And especially in the beginning, I didn't have a car, so I had to walk everywhere, and I soon realized that that's not really possible on Guam. So I think what really got the ball rolling was when I was able to rent a car. So then I was able to go to different community centers and to senior citizen centers, to mayor's offices, and everybody there was incredibly generous in helping me and giving me information and volunteering to participate in my project. And at that time I was mainly looking for people with a Chamorro background because I had to narrow down the ethnic group, and I believe that the Chamorro language, even for the people that don't speak Chamorro anymore, still has a great effect on the English language here. Then I was lucky to meet a lot of great people along the way, and they would introduce me to more and more people, and at the end the media sort of picked up on the story, and through that a lot more people heard about it, and they would contact me and would volunteer to participate or would give me any kind of information that they wanted to share with me. And that led me to the second stage of my project. After finding volunteers, I had to record people. I had to record casual conversations with them and then eventually transcribing them. The recording only took about an hour, but the transcribing phase was long and tedious, and I'm very glad that I had some help from people in Switzerland at the University of Bern who helped me transcribe. And this is an excerpt of one of the transcriptions. That would be a typical conversation that I had with a local. So we talked about the weather, and before that I tried to sort of get information about his age, level of education, time spent off island. Those were some of the facts that I needed to know, but the rest was just casual conversation. So we talked about the weather, and then we went on talking about Taco Bell for about 5 minutes. So that kind of sums up the data collection phase. It involved finding volunteers, recording conversations, and then data transcription. The next stage was conducted back in Switzerland, together with my supervisor and my colleagues who also do work on English spoken in Micronesia. We had meetings where we simply listened to the recordings, and the goal was to listen for the most salient, so the most striking features of Guam English. So what does it sound like? Is it similar to other varieties? Is there something specific about it? Are there some things that differ from other Englishes that we've researched so far? And that included features that belong to the category of prosody. That's kind of the melody of a speaker. Then lexis would be the vocabulary that someone is using. Grammatical features that can include tense. Is a person using present tense or past tense when referring to the past? double negations, things like that. Then the phonology is the sounds a speaker produces. And we carefully looked at each pronunciation of each vowel and consonant of the English language. And we even listened to sounds that are not typical in the English language. So, for example, in Palau, people pronounce the K further back. So it sounds like coconut would sound something like coconut, coconut. So it's further back in the throat is where it's produced. And that's not something you find typically in mainland US varieties or in the UK, for example. So what I would like you to do now is listen carefully to an excerpt of one of the recordings that I did. And as I suggested in the title, you've all heard Guam English. It might be the way you speak, the way your children speak, the way your students speak, anyone in Guam. And we're going to look at the variation a little bit later on. You've all heard it before, but what we want to do now is listen very closely and dissect and analyze the speech sample. And based on this, I will then give you an overview of what I found so far.
What did you do? What did you have to do?
Well, when I first came in, they make me sort mail, the incoming mail. We sort them out. We have the boxes, the alphabet, A, B, to Z. We sort them out. When the mail comes in back, we empty the bag and we sort the whatever is in that bag. And then when that is finished, we sit down. They put me in a place that for all the return mails, all the mails that are not being claimed, and they're going to be sent back to the sender. So they put me there, and I take care of all those mails.
Okay, so this is one of my oldest speakers, a 91-year-old Chamorro lady. I'm going to play the excerpt again, and this time I highlighted the words that I'm going to analyze later. So try to listen carefully to these words, and no need to listen to the context.
What did you do? What did you have to do?
Well, when I first came in, they make me sort mail, the incoming mail. We sort them out. We have the boxes, the alphabet, A, B, to Z. We sort them out. When the mail comes in back, we empty the bag and we sort the whatever is in that bag. And then when that is finished, we sit down. They put me in a place that for all the return mails, all the mails that are not being claimed, and they're going to be sent back to the sender. So they put me there, and I take care of all those mails.
Okay, so let's take a closer look at some of the words that I highlighted. Starting out with the word first. She's producing first in a way it sounds more like first, so she's deleting that last consonant. And that's what we call consonant cluster reduction. And that's found in many other varieties of English, for example, also in African American vernacular English. So what happens is that speakers simplify a cluster of consonants, st, st, and reduce it to only one consonant, s, okay? And we can see that a bit further down as well in the word finished. She says finish rather than finished. And then when listening closer to the next word, came, I can hear what we call monophthongization of the vowel A. That's also called the face vowel because it occurs in the word face. When you pronounce face, that's usually a diphthong, so there's two vowels that make up for what's spelled in only one vowel. In this speaker, however, she only produces one vowel, so keim becomes came. Keim, two vowels, came, only one vowel. Okay, then a bit further down in the transcript, you find the same thing for the words make, place, and claim. So make, place, and claim. And what's interesting about the word make also is that she's using present tense, but she's referring to a past event. Next, the vowel in the word boxes. This is produced with the tongue positioned further back and lower in the mouth than what you would find, for example, in speakers of the Midwest. So in the Midwest, someone might say baxes. But this speaker here is putting the tongue lower and further back in the mouth, boxes. And that almost sounds like I think Iona is what it's called, like Hoffa in Chamorro, so further back and lower. And we're going to look at the tongue positioning later on as well. Then the next feature marked in yellow would be the pronunciation of the letter Z. Now a lot of people here in Guam know about this feature and they've reported it to me, so they know about older speakers, for example, saying Ziploc bag. And that's so she's producing Z as J. G. Okay. And then moving on to the word bag, here I notice devoicing of the final consonant. If you place your two fingers on your voice box right here and you pronounce bag, you will feel that your voice box is vibrating. You feel a vibration. It's easier if you pronounce, if you say z and then compare it to s. You don't feel a vibration here, okay? But with this speaker, g is not voiced, so it almost sounds like a k, back, back. Okay. Then in the definite article the th sound is produced as a d bag, and that's something I also find in younger speakers, over there, that. And then we've almost covered all of the salient features in this excerpt. What's left is the pronunciation of place and take. So the speaker produces what you call unaspirated P's and T's. In many varieties of English, you will hear speakers producing a breath of air after saying P and T, so it's p, t. But here it's just p and t. And that's what I've also been told is the way the P's and T's are pronounced in Chamorro. So you wouldn't say tatamonas, you would say tatamonas. And just by analyzing this small excerpt of speech, it was only 1 minute long, we were already able to pinpoint quite a number of salient features for Guam English that don't exist in many other varieties of English across the globe. And during this analysis, you might have been thinking, well, I don't speak that way, or you might have never heard one of those features, but that's because there's a lot of variety in Guam English, and we're going to talk about that later on. So what we just did, this close analysis of this excerpt, that's what I did together with my colleagues at the University of Bern. So we would sit together in meetings, and we would listen and discuss a number of features, and then from those meetings, I came up with kind of an overview of what Guam English sounds like. And I'm going to summarize this here a little bit, but keep in mind that this is in no way exhaustive or conclusive. One of the first things that I noticed when I arrived on the island was the prosody, so the melody when someone is speaking. And that's quite unique to Guam. It's one of the main things also that people change when they're trying to imitate a typical Chamorro accent. Prosody is quite a complex field to study. It depends on various factors. It needs complex equipment, and there's not a lot of work that's been done on it before. But what I can say up to this point is that, especially in older speakers, the stress timing is based on syllables. So rather than connecting words, they pronounce each word fully. And younger speakers would produce what you call stress-timed speech flow. So instead of saying, I'm going to give a presentation, I can connect the words, I'm going to give a presentation, with the stress being on the most important words. And then furthermore, the intonation and the stress pattern stood out to me. Many speakers raise their pitch at the end of sentences or phrases. And also the production or the stress in certain English words are different from a lot of mainland varieties of English. So the word ID, for example, is pronounced on the first syllable, ID. Can I see your ID? Same with the word relocated, relocated. And interestingly enough, in Chamorro, it's also the penultimate syllable, the second but last syllable that's stressed. There are a lot of words used here on the island that are probably quite unique to Guam or the Marianas. So even when speaking English, Chamorro words are still quite frequently used. So I've heard pari, chelu, neni, and there's quite a number of them. Zoris, for example, is Japanese, a Japanese borrowing. That's also being used in other Micronesian varieties, for example, in Palau. Then there's also a lot of English words that are being used that might not be typically heard in other mainland varieties of English. Aircon is one of them. So a lot of mainland varieties will use AC. Aircon is quite typical in the UK and in Australia as well, but I've also heard someone say that in Alaska they're using aircon. Aircon. Then adding the word color before color. My car is color black is something you don't typically hear on the mainland. Then I'll follow you to the store, meaning I'll go with you, or on the light, or white complected is one. How's it for how are you doing? That's something they use in South Africa as well. And making an exhaustive list of vocabulary would be a whole different project. And that's actually been done before for the mainland US. So they've compiled the vocabulary and then put it next to a map to show where in the United States certain words are being used. This is, you can't read it properly, but this is an example for the word Coke or soda. So what word is being used in which part of the United States? In the South, a lot of sodas are referred to as Coke. In the Midwest, it's usually referred to as pop. And then California's might be more soda. And in Guam, it's also referred to as Coke. This is a picture that I copied from English the Chamorro way, which was hugely popular in the 90s. So the man says, "Buy me fan Coke," and the lady asks, "What kind?" "A 7-Up." So Coke is being a generic term used for soda, for lots of different soda drinks. But I've been told that this is kind of, soda is on the rise. People are nowadays saying soda more often than Coke. Okay. Grammatical features, same thing. I can't go through the whole list of grammatical features, so I'm just going to mention a few here. One is the use of historical present. So for example, saying, "When I retire in 2007," using present tense but referring to a past event. Then there's the interchangeable use of male and female third-person singular pronouns. That's something I heard in older speakers mostly, almost mainly. When a Chamorro lady, for example, was telling me a story, it was hard for me to keep up whether that story had already passed and whether it was a man or a woman that she was talking about. But of course, she had announced it at the beginning, and it was my job to just keep up. And it's, I guess, worth mentioning that in Chamorro, there's not a male and female third-person pronoun, but it's just gui. And then I've talked about the double negation before, so "I don't want nobody" would be an example of double negation that occurs sometimes in Guam English. And also the omitting plurality. So "one of my niece" or "I'm scared of snake" is also happens occasionally. The last category that I'm focusing on is phonology, the study of sounds in language. And this is where I'll be putting the main focus of my thesis on. We've talked about consonant devoicing briefly in the last example that I showed you, and then, so the consonants D, B, V, G, and C are devoiced by Guam English speakers, meaning that there's no vibration in the voice box. I'll play a short excerpt again so you can hear that. So bag becomes back.
When the mail comes in back.
Back. Dr. Kwan in 2010 reported that all devoiced consonants at the end of a word in Guam English are devoiced, meaning G becomes K. So bag, back. Z becomes S. Buzz becomes bus. This is again an example from English the Chamorro way. Crab, voiced, crab becomes p. Another salient feature is the unaspiration of consonants, so P, T, and K, which we briefly looked at before. So there's this no breathy sound. I'm going to play this example.
In a place.
In a place instead of place. Another feature would be L vocalization. So for this example, I found this drawing in English the Chamorro way, an apple a day. The L is not pronounced, and in its place, a vowel is used, O in this case. That happens in many other varieties of English, but also in other languages. For example, in my own Swiss German dialect, we will replace L with a U. So Bild, which means picture in German, I would pronounce it as Bild. The last category is vowels, before we get into the really nitty-gritty stuff, okay? In this example, ship is spelled as sheep, if you can see it there at the bottom. So that shows the alternative pronunciation of the short vowel I, okay? It becomes E. And to be able to explain that to you in a little bit more detail, I will introduce you to the vowel chart. Some of you might already be familiar with this. This chart represents the profile of the human oral cavity. So depending on the position of the tongue in the mouth and the rounding of the lips, we're able to produce different vowels. You can see the vowel E at the top left corner over there, for example, such as in the word fleece. It's up there because the tongue is up and forward when we produce that vowel, E. You can hear you can feel the difference if you go from A to E. Notice that your tongue is moving up and forward. You can test it if you want to. A, E. Okay. Now the kit vowel, as in the word ship, is produced a little bit lower than that. The tongue is a little bit lower, ship. But in this speaker, she produces it higher up, sheep, sheep. And the same goes for the foot vowel. O becomes U, foot. So the tongue is positioned a little bit further in the front and up in those examples. So other examples would be yelling or hit, yelling, higher up. But then kind of the opposite is happening to the vowel A, as found in trap or family, family. Okay, in many regions of the United States, a change has gone on where the vowel is not produced in its original place, but it's been raised, okay? So this is particularly happening in the Midwest. So rather than saying bag and have, people in the Midwest will say bag and have. If you've never heard this before, you can talk to Dr. Caribou. He's from the Midwest and he produces the vowels this way. In the rest of the United States, some of that change has gone on as well, especially before nasals. So before M, N, and Ng, people will raise their vowels. So they will say family, land, etc. But they will still say have. But in Guam, none of these raises have gone on. So family is still pronounced as family, land. The tongue is positioned relatively low and back in the mouth. You can test it yourself by saying these words: bag, have, half, land, family. Or do you say bag, half, land, family? So it's possible that the production of that vowel is actually moving backwards, meaning that the younger generations are now positioning their tongue lower and further back in the mouth than the older speakers. And they have found this in some ethnic varieties of California English speakers, and also at the University of Hawaii, Professor Drager has found that in Hawaii English speakers, that they will produce the vowel this way. And I will be spending the next few months looking at this feature in more detail. And that's when we get into the really nitty-gritty stuff of this talk. So we're able to closely analyze the pronunciation of vowels and consonants with linguistic programs. This, for example, is PROT, a software that's used regularly by phoneticians. And what you can see here is the sound wave of one of my participants when she pronounces the word land. And we can then zoom in on that word and go in and measure the frequency of the vowel.
Big land.
Lan, okay? And by measuring this vowel, we will be then able to explain how exactly Guam English speakers are producing that vowel. Now, why is this important? I've explained to you before that there are hundreds of different varieties of English spoken across the globe, and in many instances, English has become the first language of the inhabitants, or it's become the language of business and education. And there is no sign of decline of English. And it appears to be spreading. Linguists around the world are interested in finding out the ways of how English is developing. How is it changing nowadays? Okay. And up to this point, I've explained to you how English arrived on the island of Guam, what it sounds like nowadays. We've analyzed it closely. But with this, we could find out where the English might be moving to. What do younger people sound like? What will the next generation sound like? The Electronic World Atlas of Varieties of English, called eWave, has already listed a number of Englishes where they go into that really detailed analysis. They mainly focus on grammatical features. So as you can see, the Micronesian area has not really been covered yet, so there hasn't been a careful description of these Englishes yet. And by studying Guam English, I would be able to contribute to an atlas like this. And I will now address the last point of my talk, the variation in Guam English. I've spent the majority of my talk referring to Guam English in a way that might suggest that it's just one variety, but in fact there's a lot of variation. So much that a lot of scholars before me have used different terms. Babasa, for example, has referred to it as Guam dialect of English, to refer to a more vernacular variety. So has Dr. Kwan when she said Guam's colloquial Chamorro English. And then there's also a lot of Caucasians and Filipinos that were born and raised on Guam that sound different. And especially there's a difference between older and younger speakers. So there's many social factors that I need to consider when looking at the variation of Guam English. And age is definitely one of them, and one of the most significant ones as well. So my older speaker grew up speaking Chamorro, but a lot of younger speakers grew up speaking English monolingually. And you can really hear that difference in the next speaker that I'm going to play you. This young female Chamorro speaker has hardly left the island, or had hardly left the island when I interviewed her, but you can hear a lot of features of mainland US varieties. So don't worry, I'm not going to go into much detail here anymore. I will just point out a few features, but I'm going to let you listen to it first.
So it's because I didn't want to learn. Yeah, I had that whole mindset, like, you know, it's not, I'm only hearing this in the class, in my Chamorro class.
Yeah, you're not using it.
Yeah, it's not like an everyday language kind of thing. That's the mindset that I had, and I feel very terrible for thinking like that right now, but you know, I'm doing something right now, so that's where I'm trying to make up for it. So yeah, my mom speaks Chamorro. She only spoke to her mom and her dad in Chamorro, so when I'm around them, I can understand, you know, I can hear the language and everything. And
So Chamorro was her first language?
yes,
Is?
yes, because she was raised by her grandma and grandpa. Yeah, my mom is 53.
Okay. So this speaker is using a lot more terms that are typical for the mainland US. Yeah, like, you know. She's also using crossword assimilation, so she's not stressing each syllable individually, but she's connecting them. That's when I'm trying to make up for it in that example. She's also using the past to refer to past events. But then some features remain, like language is pronounced with an open vowel, and grandma is also pronounced with a back vowel. grandma. Okay. So age is certainly an important factor to consider, but then there's also education. Someone who went to private school might sound different from someone who went to public school, and someone who is highly educated sounds different from someone who has less years of schooling. Then gender, or the sex of a person, has an influence, and it's been shown to be highly significant. For example, women have been shown to be sort of the leaders of sound change, and they're also known to be a little bit more standardized in speaking. The region, a lot of people have told me that they can tell if someone's from the south here in Guam by the way they speak. And then mobility is very important. Many people on Guam have left the island for a considerable amount of time. So they might have gone to Hawaii or the mainland for family or schooling. And during the traditional days of language research, people would research the people that have hardly left the island. But this is not really realistic for Guam because a lot of people have left the island and then come back. Okay. Then the social network of someone is important. So people are able to style switch. So someone might be speaking differently when they're talking to me as of when they're talking to the guys, the boys, so they might change the way they speak in that sense. And then finally, the ethnic groups are also important. So people that are of Filipino ethnic background might sound differently from someone who is of Chamorro background. Okay. And as I continue my research, I will consider Filipinos and Caucasians that were born and raised on Guam as well. That will be sort of the next part of my project. And then in the coming years, I will continue to closely analyze Guam English. And towards the beginning of next year, I'm going to be publishing a book together with my colleagues from the University of Bern. And we will be publishing a book about the English spoken in Micronesia, and Guam will be a chapter in there. Okay, and I will be spending another 2 weeks on the island. I'll be spending most of my time at MARC researching, but if you happen to know anybody who is of Filipino or Caucasian descent who was born and raised on Guam, please let me know if they want to be part of the project as well. Okay, so that's it. Thank you very much for listening to my talk.
Does anybody have any questions? Any questions for Eva?
Is it possible? I know it is possible that the language English is oral tradition, so the P and the B are the same, the D and the T is the same. Can you elaborate on that?
Okay, so that P and B are the same.
You don't even know that they're different letters. If you say you're uneducated in 1940, you don't know that P and B are different letters, or T and T.
You think that's the case, that people don't know the difference between the letters?
I have a dog and his name is Deets, and I can never tell him that I'm not saying Teets.
It's one option that people don't know that there's different letters, but it's very possible that the pronunciation is just the way it is, so that there's voicing and devoicing. And that happens in highly educated people. It happens in many varieties of English.
That's a very interesting thing that you're doing. I'm just curious because Guam is still going through development in terms of even its use of English. It's not yet as established as it is something like Hawaii or others where there is no longer a native tongue. In Guam, a lot of people will not speak to English as their second language. And one of the variables that I saw, I didn't see that, and I thought that would be an important variable to look at, is whether English is the first or the second language.
Absolutely.
From the age, and the younger they are, the more English and less towards
Exactly.
converted kind of thing with age.
Exactly.
English speaking.
Mhm.
So I think those would be very important. And also, listening to your sample, the case sample, I could only predict what the background of that person is.
Mhm.
I think it's important to look at the characteristics terms of analyzing their speech patterns, or, that part. And I hope that that's part of that. Because if you were to look at Guam speech pattern, you could collect a variety of radio shows where people speak English and analyze those speech patterns in there too. Not necessarily picking up, little things, but I think that might, enlighten the study more by having a range of types of speakers that speak English on the whole.
Exactly. I think that's what makes Guam such an interesting place to research as well, is that that shift from one language to another has happened so recently that we still have older speakers that claim that that their first language is Chamorro, and then a lot of younger speakers who don't speak Chamorro anymore or not fluently. So that's definitely something I'm going to consider in my study. And also, like you said, you can tell that you can predict someone's background by listening to them. I have a list of characteristics of my speakers that I keep in my files that describe them, where they went to school, what area in Guam they grew up in, their age, their level of education, their profession, etc. And I think all of these might play a role.
Thank you, Eva.
Thank you.
Very enlightening. My question is, at what point in your thesis, your dissertation, or your thesis, are you going to speak to the issue of Chamorro as a language and how these variations have a lot to do with the language, the indigenous language itself? Because I feel that this is very, very important. I mean, it's very clear to me, and I understand why pick versus pig are said exactly the same thing. And of course, in American English, we've got pin and pin, right? Is it that item that can prick you, or is it that item that you can write with? But for me, as a reader of this, and as someone who speaks Chamorro fluently, and I hope I speak English fluently as well, it's very important so that I can put this in context, because one of the things that I shy away from are when we start making, and I know this is not what you're doing, but there are occasions when a study is put forth and we start to look at it as, well, this is probably making my English inferior. And I know that's not the goal here. That's not the purpose. So I am very appreciative, but I'm just wondering if at all that is one of the things that you will include, and if not, why not, and if so, at what point would that come into your discussion? But thank you. I mean, this is stuff that Julieta Babasa, whom you mentioned, and she's one person that you should probably have as part of your informants for Filipina speaking English on Guam. She's been here a long time as well. And so that's my question, and thank you.
Okay, thank you. So you're right. I mean, Chamorro is something that I need to look into more carefully, and I'm taking Chamorro classes right now, and after every lesson, I feel like I learn more about why certain things might be the way they are, because it might be influenced by Chamorro. But it's also kind of risky always to say, oh, this is why you talk like this, because of this and this reason. As I said, this is what we're doing is descriptive work. So it's not really about why it came to be, but we're just describing how it is. And Chamorro and the change of language, etc., will be coming in my thesis. I will be talking about this, but as I've said before, the main focus is on the description of certain salient features, and one of them being that open trap vowel. So a lot of my thesis will simply be about at what frequency this vowel is being produced, at what frequency it's being reported to be produced in other varieties of English, and perhaps also in Chamorro.
I just wanted to ask another question. So in other words, the study that you're doing is not going to be necessarily the people of Guam, but how English is spoken in Guam. but your sample are predominantly Chamorros, right?
Exactly. At this point, my sample is predominantly Chamorros, but I'm looking into the Filipino community and the Caucasian Americans that might have moved from the mainland here, or people that were born and raised here. So I'll have 3 ethnic groups.
Yeah, because there are two compounding variables that you're going to run. One is the native speaker Chamorro, and the other thing is that the environment around which, it has nothing to do with ethnicity, it has to do with the location of it is, and how people communicate on this. It's very hard to differentiate that.
Mm-hmm. And so in previous research, in like the traditional dialectology and linguistic research, they would look for, as I said before, the people that have hardly moved, that usually they were looking for old males, that have hardly left the place that they were born in. And Guam, you're absolutely right, is so much more complex than that, because that would not draw the right picture of Guam. People are different ethnic groups. They interact with different people. There's different circles, and it's quite hard to actually grasp that. And I think, as sort of one of the first overview descriptions, it's going to be hard to do justice to all of that variation, but I'm going to try my best.
Sarah? I just want to say congratulations on a successful presentation. Curious question, what other people or region or country is the Guam English most similar to? Do you know that?
Mm-hmm. So one thing that I'm really looking forward to is discussing my work with my colleague who is also at the University of Bern, who did research on Saipan English, because for various reasons they're going to be very similar, the 2 Englishes, but how are they different? We're going to have a long discussion about that. Perhaps we'll produce a paper as well. And then during our meetings, really all of my colleagues that went to Micronesia, which you would think it's somewhat close to each other, the islands, somewhat. But they said that it sounds completely different. There's completely different sounds. There's different, also body language, what I find is that there's some findings that are similar in Hawaiian English and California English, which would in some way make sense, because people often go visit family in Hawaii and California. That's one possibility, but we'll see.
All right, well, then I think that takes you off the hook. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I have something to present to you. Our honorarium sponsors are going to feed you for the next 11 days.
That's perfect.
Yes, I'm sure you'll enjoy that. Amista Restaurant, Circle K, Cold Stone Creamery, Crust Pizzeria, Fruits, King's Restaurant, Linda's Cafe, Linda's Coffee Shop, Lone Star Steakhouse, Mezcla, Wendy's, and Yogurtland.
Good.
You enjoy yourself. Thank
Yes.
you very much
Thank
for
you.
presenting here at the university and for the MARC lecture series. It was wonderful to have you.
Thank you very much.
There you go.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Thank you.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, our next presentation will be November 21st, and Judy Flores will be presenting that. So we hope to have you back. Thank you for being with us.